Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. February 14, 1945. The temperature hovered at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, but Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto stood motionless against the wire fence, his breath forming white clouds in the darkness. From across the frozen compound, sound drifted through the brittle air. Not the regimented military marches he'd known his entire life, not the ceremonial precision of traditional Japanese instruments, but something that made no sense to his ears. A trumpet wailed like a man crying and laughing simultaneously. A piano cascaded through notes that seemed to argue with each other before finding impossible harmony. A saxophone moaned with a loneliness that reached across the barbed wire and grabbed his chest. Yamamoto, who had survived the hell of Tarawa, who had watched his entire company die in the surf, who had been taught since childhood that surrender was worse than death, felt something wet on his frozen cheeks. He was crying, and he didn't know why. Behind him, dozens of other Japanese prisoners of war stood in the snow, their faces turned toward the American Recreation Hall, where the Camp McCoy Jazz Ensemble rehearsed every Wednesday night. Some wept openly. Others stood rigid, fighting emotions they'd been trained to suppress since they could walk. A few had their eyes closed, as if trying to memorize something sacred before it disappeared forever. Private First Class Robert Chin, a Chinese-American guard whose family had fled Japanese occupation in Shanghai, watched the scene with growing unease. He'd been conditioned to hate these men, these soldiers of the empire that had raped Nanking and bombed Pearl Harbor. But watching them cry to Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo complicated everything he thought he understood about the enemy. He radioed the command post, his voice uncertain. "Sir, you need to see this. Something's happening at the fence line. The Japanese prisoners there." He paused, searching for words that made sense. "They're listening to the music. And they're breaking down." What neither the prisoners nor their guards understood that frozen February night was that they were witnessing a collision between two incompatible universes. The Japanese soldiers had been raised in a culture where music existed to reinforce discipline, tradition, and imperial authority. Every note was prescribed. Every performance was identical to the last. Individuality in music, like individuality in life, was dangerous deviation. Jazz, with its improvisation, its emotional rawness, its celebration of individual voice within collective creation, represented everything the Imperial Japanese military had spent decades trying to eliminate from its soldiers' consciousness. The American officers running Camp McCoy had no intention of waging psychological warfare through music. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Sullivan, the camp's recreation officer and a former pianist from Harlem, had simply needed somewhere for the bass jazz ensemble to practice without disturbing administrative offices. The recreation hall sat on the opposite side of the compound from the POW barracks. Sullivan figured the prisoners wouldn't care about American music. He was catastrophically wrong. The story of how jazz broke through decades of militaristic conditioning begins not with the music itself, but with the silence that preceded it. The silence of men who believed themselves dead. When the first waves of Japanese prisoners arrived at American camps in late 1943 and throughout 1944, they came expecting torture, execution, or at best, labor until death. The Imperial Japanese Army had conditioned its soldiers with a simple equation. Surrender equals dishonor equals death. Captured training manuals and diaries revealed the depth of this programming. One diary, belonging to a private captured on Saipan, contained a final entry written before his unit's banzai charge. "Tomorrow I die with honor. If I am wounded and cannot die, I pray for the strength to take my own life. Capture is not an option. My family will know I served the emperor with loyalty." That soldier didn't die in the banzai charge. He woke up in an American field hospital with a shattered leg, pumped full of morphine, surrounded by enemy doctors who were trying to save his life. The cognitive dissonance was total. According to everything he'd been taught, this moment was impossible. Americans were subhuman devils who tortured prisoners. Yet they'd given him anesthesia during surgery. They'd set his broken bones. A nurse had even smiled at him. The silence that settled over Japanese POWs in American custody was not the silence of defiance. It was the silence of men whose entire worldview had shattered and who had no framework to process what was happening. They couldn't write letters home because their families had been told they were dead, honorable deaths in service to the emperor. They'd been officially erased from existence. Many stopped speaking altogether, retreating into a psychological void where nothing made sense anymore. The American military, unprepared for prisoners who had been culturally programmed to prefer death, struggled to manage camps filled with men experiencing existential crisis. Standard interrogation techniques failed. Offers of better treatment for cooperation went nowhere. The prisoners weren't refusing to cooperate out of loyalty. They were catatonic with shame and confusion. Into this psychological wasteland, someone made a decision that would accidentally change everything. At Camp McCoy, Lieutenant Sullivan submitted a request in January 1945 to use the recreation hall near the POW compound for evening jazz rehearsals. His reasoning was purely practical. The officers' club was too small, and the enlisted men's barracks were too loud. The request was approved without discussion. Nobody thought the Japanese prisoners would care about American music. Nobody knew that jazz had been officially banned in Japan since 1940. The Imperial Japanese government's relationship with Western music had always been complicated. During the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, Japan had eagerly adopted Western military marches and classical music as symbols of modernization. But as militarism intensified in the 1930s, authorities became increasingly paranoid about foreign cultural influence. Jazz, with its African-American origins, its association with nightclubs and dancing, its improvisational chaos, was deemed particularly dangerous. In 1940, the government issued explicit regulations banning jazz from radio broadcasts and public performance. The official reasoning cited degenerate Western culture and music that promotes individualism and disorder. Police raided Tokyo jazz clubs, confiscating records and instruments. Musicians were arrested. Possession of American jazz records became grounds for suspicion of anti-government sentiment. By 1943, listening to jazz in Japan could get you investigated by the Kempeitai, the military police known for their brutal interrogation methods. The soldiers arriving at Camp McCoy had been raised in this environment. Most had never heard jazz. Those who had encountered it before the ban remembered it as forbidden, dangerous, something associated with Western decadence and Japan's enemies. And now, in this frozen Wisconsin prison camp, thousands of miles from home, officially dead to their families and their nation, they were hearing it for the first time with nothing left to lose. December 16, 1944. The first rehearsal. The camp ensemble consisted of 12 musicians: a trumpet, 2 saxophones, a trombone, piano, bass, drums, guitar, and a clarinet. Most were professional musicians before the draft, men from Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Kansas City. They'd been playing together for 6 months, tight enough to swing hard, loose enough to leave space for improvisation. Lieutenant Sullivan counted off "Take the A Train," and the iconic opening notes cut through the winter air. Across the compound, in Barracks 7, former Corporal Yamamoto was lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about Tarawa. When the music reached his ears, his first reaction was confusion, so profound it bordered on anger. What was this sound? It had no structure he recognized. The instruments seemed to be fighting each other, then suddenly agreeing, then splitting apart again. There was no melody in the traditional sense, no prescribed progression. The trumpet player hit a series of notes that shouldn't work together, but somehow created a feeling Yamamoto couldn't name. His heart rate increased. His breath came faster. He sat up, disoriented. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some covered their ears. Others sat frozen, listening with an intensity that frightened them. A former naval aviation mechanic named Kenji Sato, who'd maintained 0 fighters at Rabaul before his capture, felt his chest tighten. He'd been trained to think of Americans as culturally inferior, lacking the discipline and refinement of Japanese civilization. But this music, this impossible, chaotic, beautiful sound, spoke of something he'd never encountered: controlled freedom. The Japanese military had music, certainly. Every unit had its songs, its marches. But every note was prescribed. You sang the same words the same way every time. Deviation was punished. Individuality was crushed. But this American music, it seemed to celebrate the very thing Japanese military culture worked to eliminate. Each musician was playing their own voice, but somehow it all worked together. How was that possible? In the guard tower, Private Chin watched as prisoners began emerging from their barracks, drawn toward the fence line closest to the recreation hall. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to hear better. He'd been briefed on escape attempts, on riots, on violence. Nobody had briefed him on prisoners crying while listening to jazz. The rehearsal lasted 2 hours. When it ended, The prisoners remained at the fence for another 30 minutes, standing in silence as if waiting for the music to return. Some were openly weeping. Others stood with their arms wrapped around themselves, shivering from cold and something else. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't in any manual. Lieutenant Sullivan, packing up his sheet music inside the hall, had no idea what was happening outside. To him, it had been a decent rehearsal, a little sloppy on the bridge of In the Mood, but they'd nailed the ending of String of Pearls. He was thinking about next week's set list when Captain Morrison, the camp security officer, found him. "Lieutenant, we need to talk about your rehearsals." Sullivan's heart sank. He figured someone had complained about the noise. But Morrison's expression wasn't angry. It was confused. "The Japanese prisoners," Morrison said slowly. "They're reacting to your music. We don't know how to describe it. You should see for yourself." The following Wednesday, December 23rd, Sullivan arrived early for rehearsal and positioned himself where he could observe the POW compound. The prisoners were already gathering at the fence, an hour before the music would start. They stood in small groups, not talking, just waiting. When the ensemble launched into their opening number, Sullivan watched through binoculars as the faces across the wire transformed. He'd grown up in Harlem, played rent parties and speakeasies, seen jazz move people in countless ways. But he'd never seen anything like this. These men weren't tapping their feet or swaying. They were experiencing something closer to religious ecstasy or psychological breakdown. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others stood rigid, fists clenched, as if fighting an internal battle. A few had collapsed to their knees in the snow. Sullivan lowered his binoculars, shaken. He turned to the saxophone player beside him. "Do you see what I'm seeing?" The saxophonist, a schoolteacher from Detroit named Marcus Webb, nodded slowly. "I see it. I don't understand it, but I see it." What Sullivan was witnessing was the sound of psychological conditioning cracking apart. Every Japanese soldier had been raised in a system designed to eliminate individual emotional expression. You existed to serve the emperor, to serve your unit, to die with honor. Personal feelings were weakness. Crying was shameful. Music existed to reinforce these values, never to challenge them. But jazz, at its core, is about individual emotional expression within a collective framework. Every solo is a musician saying, "This is what I feel right now, in this moment." The improvisation isn't chaos, it's radical honesty. You can't fake a jazz solo. You can't perform it by rote. You have to feel it, and the feeling has to be real. For men who'd spent their entire lives suppressing individual emotion, who'd been trained to view emotional expression as weakness, hearing music that was nothing but pure emotional expression was like watching someone break every sacred rule and somehow create beauty instead of chaos. It didn't just challenge their conditioning, it shattered it. By January 1945, word had spread through the POW population. The Wednesday night rehearsals became the week's focal point. Prisoners who'd been uncommunicative for months began asking interpreters questions. What is this music called? Why do the musicians play different notes each time? How is it possible to create order without rules? The interpreters, mostly Japanese-American soldiers from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team or the Military Intelligence Service, found these questions almost impossible to answer. How do you explain jazz to someone who's never encountered the concept of musical improvisation? How do you describe freedom to someone who's been taught that freedom is disorder? Private First Class Daniel Inoue, a young Nisei interpreter who would later become a U.S. Senator, tried his best. The music is called jazz. It's American music, but it comes from Black Americans, from Africa originally. The musicians know the basic structure, the chord changes, but within that structure, each person plays what they feel. It's individual and collective at the same time. The prisoner asking the question, a former schoolteacher named Hiroshi Tanaka, shook his head in disbelief. But how do they know what to play if it's not written down? How do they avoid chaos? Inoue thought carefully. They listen to each other. They respond to what the other musicians are playing. It's like a conversation where everyone talks, but somehow nobody interrupts. It's about trust and respect and individual voice. Tanaka's eyes filled with tears. We were taught that individual voice is dangerous, that it leads to disorder and weakness. But this music, it's not weak. It's strong. How can something so undisciplined create such beauty? Inoue had no answer. He filed a report to his commanding officer, noting that the jazz rehearsals were having a profound psychological effect on the prisoners, but he couldn't adequately describe what that effect was. All he knew was that men who'd been silent for months were starting to talk. Men who'd seemed dead behind the eyes were showing signs of life. And it all traced back to Wednesday nights. Lieutenant Sullivan, increasingly aware of the impact his rehearsals were having, made a controversial proposal to Colonel Anderson, the camp commander. "Sir, I think we should allow prisoners who volunteer to attend the rehearsals inside the hall. Under strict supervision, of course. I think this music is reaching them in ways our interrogators can't." Anderson's first instinct was to refuse. The security risks were obvious. But the camp psychologist, Captain Robert Weiss, supported the idea. "Colonel, these men are experiencing severe depression and post-traumatic stress. Many have attempted suicide. Standard therapeutic approaches aren't working because we can't communicate across the cultural divide. But somehow, this music is communicating. I think we should see where it leads." On February 7, 1945, an announcement was made in the POW compound. Prisoners who wished to attend the Wednesday night jazz rehearsal could volunteer. They would be searched, escorted under armed guard, and required to sit in designated areas away from the musicians. No talking would be permitted. Any disturbance would result in immediate return to the compound. The American officers expected maybe 20 volunteers. They received over 300 requests within 2 hours. They had to establish a lottery system. February 14, 1945. The night Corporal Yamamoto stood crying at the fence was also the night that 40 Japanese prisoners sat in folding chairs inside the recreation hall, surrounded by armed guards, listening to jazz for the first time without wire and distance between them and the source. Lieutenant Sullivan felt his hands shake as he lifted them to the piano keys. He'd played for presidents and gangsters, for high society and dive bars. But he'd never felt pressure like this. These men, these enemy soldiers, were about to experience something that might break them further or might bring them back to life. He didn't know which. He counted off Mood Indigo. The opening piano notes filled the hall. And then he heard something that made him miss a chord. The Japanese prisoners were weeping. Not quietly. Openly, with the kind of raw, uncontrolled grief that comes from years of suppression finally breaking through. The American guards shifted uncomfortably, hands on their weapons, unsure if this was a security threat or a mental breakdown or something else entirely. But the prisoners weren't aggressive. They weren't even moving. They just sat in their chairs, faces wet with tears, listening as if their lives depended on hearing every note. When the song ended, there was supposed to be a brief pause before the next number. Instead, silence stretched for nearly a minute. Sullivan looked at his bandmates, uncertain. Then one of the prisoners, a man later identified as Corporal Yamamoto, stood slowly. The guards tensed. Yamamoto bowed deeply, a formal Japanese bow of profound respect. Then he spoke in halting English. "Thank you. You make us remember we are human." He sat down. The hall remained silent. Sullivan, a black man from Harlem who'd faced his own share of discrimination and dehumanization in America, felt tears in his own eyes. He nodded to the band. They played Take the A Train. Over the following weeks, the Wednesday night concerts became a phenomenon that camp administrators struggled to understand or control. The psychological transformation in the prisoners who attended was undeniable. Men who'd been suicidal became engaged with life. Men who'd refused to cooperate with interrogators began talking freely. The change wasn't about extracting military intelligence, it was about restoring humanity. Dr. Weiss, the camp psychologist, wrote in his reports, "The jazz rehearsals are achieving what months of standard psychological intervention could not. These men were trained to view emotional expression as weakness and individual identity as dangerous. Jazz, as an art form centered on individual emotional expression within a collective structure, is teaching them that emotion and individuality are not weaknesses but sources of strength. The tears are not grief, they are relief. For the first time since capture, possibly for the first time in their adult lives, they have permission to feel." But not everyone saw the concerts as therapeutic. Some American guards, particularly those who'd fought in the Pacific, viewed the prisoners' emotional reactions with contempt. "They're crying over music while our boys died at Bataan," one guard told Sullivan angrily. "They don't deserve this kindness." Sullivan understood the anger. His own cousin had died at Guadalcanal. But he'd seen something in that recreation hall that complicated his hatred. "Those men in there," he told the guard quietly, "they're not the ones who made the decisions that started this war. They're just kids who got fed lies and put in uniforms. The same as our boys. The music is reminding them of that. And yeah, maybe they don't deserve kindness. But if we can't show humanity to defeated enemies, what the hell are we fighting for? The argument continued throughout the camp, dividing officers and enlisted men alike. But the concerts continued, and the change in the prisoners deepened. Former aviation mechanic Kenji Sato, who'd attended every concert he was allowed to, asked interpreter Inoue a question in late March that revealed the depth of his transformation. In Japan, we were taught that Americans are weak because you value individual freedom over collective discipline. But this music, it shows that individual freedom and collective unity are not opposites. How is this possible? Inoue smiled. That's the American experiment. We're still figuring it out ourselves. But jazz might be the best example of how it's supposed to work. Everyone has a voice. Everyone contributes. But you have to listen to each other, or it falls apart. It requires discipline, just a different kind than you were taught. Sato nodded slowly. Everything we were told was a lie. Americans aren't weak. You're strong in a way we couldn't understand. The music proves it. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died. The jazz ensemble canceled that week's rehearsal. The Japanese prisoners, upon hearing the news, asked through interpreters if they could hold a moment of silence for the American president. The request stunned the camp administration. These were enemy soldiers, captured while trying to kill Americans, now wanting to honor the American commander-in-chief. Colonel Anderson approved the request. On the evening of April 18th, 200 Japanese prisoners stood in formation in the compound yard and observed 1 minute of silence for Franklin Roosevelt. When the minute ended, they bowed in the direction of Washington, D.C. A photographer captured the moment. The image eventually reached newspapers across America, generating controversy and confusion. How could enemy soldiers honor the president? What did it mean? Lieutenant Sullivan understood. The music had done what propaganda and force could not. It had reminded everyone involved that the enemy was human. And once you recognize someone's humanity, once you've cried together over the same beauty, it becomes much harder to see them as monsters. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The war with Japan continued. The prisoners at Camp McCoy listened to news of American advances with complicated emotions. They wanted the killing to stop. But they knew that American victory meant Japanese defeat, meant their nation's honor destroyed, meant facing families who believed they were dead. The jazz concerts continued through May and June. The set lists began to include slower, more melancholic numbers. Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's haunting song about lynching in the American South, became a frequent request from the prisoners, even though they didn't understand the English lyrics. The mournful trumpet solo spoke a universal language of suffering and injustice that transcended words. Private Chun, the Chinese-American guard who'd first witnessed the prisoners crying at the fence, found himself in conversation with Corporal Yamamoto one evening after a concert. Through interpreter Inoue, they talked about music, about war, about home. "My family is from Shanghai," Chun said. "Your army did terrible things there. Things I can't forgive." Yamamoto nodded, his face heavy with shame. "I was not there, but I know. We were told we were bringing order and civilization. We were told Chinese were inferior and needed Japanese rule. I believed it. I am ashamed." Chun studied the man's face, seeing genuine remorse. "Why are you telling me this now?" "The music," Yamamoto said simply. "It teaches me that every person has a voice, that every life has value. I cannot hear that trumpet cry and still believe that some people are superior to others. The music makes such lies impossible." On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. In the recreation hall at Camp McCoy, the jazz ensemble played to a full house of Japanese prisoners. There was no celebration of victory, no gloating. Instead, Lieutenant Sullivan chose to close with Duke Ellington's Solitude, a piece about loneliness and longing for home. When the final notes faded, the hall sat in complete silence. Then, as one, all the prisoners stood and bowed deeply. They would be going home, to a Japan devastated by war, occupied by the nation that had defeated them, their families uncertain if they'd survived. They would face shame and suspicion for having surrendered. But they would also carry something unexpected, a memory of music that had reminded them they were human beings, not just soldiers. The repatriation process took months. As prisoners prepared to leave Camp McCoy in late 1945 and early 1946, many asked the interpreters how they could find this music in Japan. Some wanted to know if they could learn to play it. Others simply wanted to hear it again. Corporal Yamamoto, boarding the transport ship that would carry him back to Yokohama, carried with him a gift from Lieutenant Sullivan, a list of jazz recordings written on a piece of sheet music. When you get home, Sullivan had told him through an interpreter, find these records. Listen to them. Remember that you're more than what your government told you to be. Yamamoto bowed low, tears in his eyes. The music saved my life. Not my body, my spirit. I was dead inside. The jazz brought me back. I will never forget. The story might have ended there, a curious footnote in the vast archive of World War II. But the impact of those Wednesday night concerts rippled forward through history in ways nobody anticipated. In occupied Japan, 1946 to 1952, American forces brought jazz with them. For the first time, Japanese civilians could hear legally what had been banned for years. Many of the former POWs, returned home to a devastated nation, sought out this music. Some, like Kenji Sato, taught themselves to play, forming the nucleus of Japan's nascent jazz scene. By the 1950s, Tokyo had jazz clubs that rivaled those in New York and Paris. Japanese musicians became some of the world's finest jazz performers. The connection between American jazz and Japanese musical culture became so strong that by the 1960s, Blue Note Records was pressing albums specifically for the Japanese market, knowing they'd find an audience more dedicated than anywhere else in the world. But the deeper legacy was personal. The men who'd cried at Camp McCoy carried with them a secret knowledge, that the enemy they'd been taught to hate had shown them more humanity in defeat than their own government had shown them in service. That an art form created by oppressed Black Americans had become the bridge between two nations locked in racist warfare. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Camp McCoy held a reunion. Former prisoners and former guards were invited. Dozens attended, elderly men returning to the place where their lives had changed. Takashi Yamamoto, now a retired schoolteacher from Osaka, brought with him a worn record sleeve. Inside was Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo, the 1930 recording, scratched from decades of play. He'd bought it in Tokyo in 1946, one of the first purchases he'd made after returning home. Lieutenant James Sullivan, now a renowned jazz pianist who'd played Carnegie Hall and toured Europe, brought his portable keyboard. The two men, now in their 70s, met in the former recreation hall, now a museum and community center. Through an interpreter, Yamamoto told Sullivan, "For 40 years, I have listened to this record. Every time, I remember that night in February when I first heard you play. I was a dead man then. Your music taught me to feel again. It taught me that individual voice and collective harmony are not enemies. It taught me that Americans were not the monsters we'd been told you were." He paused, emotional. But it did something else too. It made me question everything. If my government had lied about Americans, what else had they lied about? That question led me to democracy, to pacifism, to teaching my students to think critically and question authority. Your jazz didn't just save my life. It changed how I lived it. Sullivan wiped tears from his eyes. We were just playing music, man. We didn't know what it would do. Yamamoto shook his head. You played truth. In a world of propaganda and lies, you played honest emotion. That's revolutionary. Sullivan set up his keyboard. A small crowd of veterans, both American and Japanese, gathered. He played Mood Indigo, the same arrangement from that February night in 1945. His fingers were older, stiffer, but the music was still there. Still honest. Still true. When he finished, Yamamoto spoke in English, words he'd practiced for weeks. "Thank you. You make us remember we are human." The same words he'd spoken 40 years earlier. Sullivan stood and embraced the elderly Japanese man, both of them crying. Around them, other veterans, American and Japanese, stood in silence, many with tears streaming down their faces. In the decades since, historians have documented the Camp McCoy jazz concerts and similar incidents at other POW camps. The phenomenon wasn't unique to Wisconsin. Wherever American guards played jazz, wherever Japanese prisoners could hear it, similar reactions occurred. The tears, the transformation, the crack in ideological conditioning. Academic papers have been written analyzing why jazz had this specific effect. Some scholars point to the fundamental opposition between jazz's improvisational freedom and Japanese militaristic culture's rigid control. Others note that music bypasses linguistic and cultural barriers, communicating emotion directly. Still others argue that the prisoners were simply responding to being treated as human beings for the first time since capture, and the music was just the vehicle. But perhaps the simplest explanation came from Kenji Sato, the former aviation mechanic who became one of Japan's first post-war jazz musicians. In a 1978 interview, he said, "We'd been taught that showing emotion was weakness, that individual expression was dangerous, that we existed only to serve the collective. Then we heard music that was nothing but individual emotional expression, and it wasn't chaos. It was beautiful. It proved everything we'd been taught was wrong. The tears were not sadness. They were liberation." The legacy of those Wednesday night concerts extends beyond music. The POWs who experienced jazz at American camps returned to Japan and became disproportionately involved in democratic movements, education reform, and cultural exchange programs. They'd seen the enemy's humanity, and that experience made them advocates for peace and international understanding. Today, Japan has one of the world's most vibrant jazz scenes. Tokyo's Blue Note Club is considered one of the finest jazz venues globally. Japanese jazz musicians are respected worldwide. Young Japanese players travel to America to study jazz at Berkeley and Juilliard, unaware that their nation's love affair with this music began with prisoners of war crying at a fence in Wisconsin. The Camp McCoy Museum maintains a permanent exhibit on the jazz concerts, including audio recordings of the original ensemble, photographs of prisoners at the fence, and testimonials from both guards and prisoners. The centerpiece is Lieutenant Sullivan's piano, the same one he played in 1945, preserved and occasionally played during special commemorative concerts. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, the museum hosted a concert featuring both American and Japanese jazz musicians playing together. The audience included grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original prisoners and guards. During the performance of Mood Indigo, a young Japanese saxophonist and an elderly African-American trumpet player shared a solo, their instruments in conversation, creating something neither could have created alone. Individual voices, collective harmony, the essential paradox of jazz, the essential promise of democracy, the lesson learned by men who'd been taught that such things were impossible. The story of Japanese soldiers crying to jazz in American POW camps is not ultimately about music, though music was the catalyst. It's about what happens when propaganda meets truth, when dehumanization confronts humanity, when rigid ideology encounters emotional honesty. It's about the power of art to reach across barriers of language, culture, and hatred to remind us of our shared humanity. The tears that fell at Camp McCoy in the winter of 1945 were tears of recognition. Men who'd been taught they were nothing but tools of the state, that their lives had value only in service and death, heard music that insisted they were human beings with individual souls worth expressing. That revelation was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it offered a path back to life. Devastating because it meant admitting that everything they'd suffered and sacrificed had been based on lies. Jazz didn't win the war. American industrial might, Allied cooperation, and Japanese miscalculation won the war. But jazz won something arguably more important. It won back the humanity of men who'd lost it. It proved that even in the midst of total war, even between enemies who'd been taught to view each other as subhuman, beauty and truth could still break through. Lieutenant James Sullivan played his last public concert in 2001 at age 83. The final song of the evening was Mood Indigo. Afterward, a reporter asked him about the legend of the Japanese prisoners crying to his music at Camp McCoy. Sullivan smiled, his eyes distant with memory. "People ask me about that a lot. They want to know how it felt to change lives through music. But here's the truth. Those men changed my life as much as I changed theirs. I'd grown up black in America, Jim Crow, discrimination, all of it. I'd been taught to hate the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. But when I saw those men crying, when I realized that my music, created by my people who'd been enslaved and oppressed, was reaching the hearts of enemy soldiers and reminding them they were human, it changed how I understood everything." He paused, searching for words. Jazz came from suffering, from slavery and oppression, and people who refused to let that suffering destroy their humanity. It came from people who insisted on their right to be heard, to express themselves, to be fully human no matter what society said they were. When those Japanese soldiers heard that music, they weren't just hearing notes and rhythms. They were hearing the sound of people refusing to be dehumanized. And they recognized it because they'd been dehumanized too, just by a different system. So did the music save them? Yeah, I think it did. But it saved me too. It reminded me that the enemy is never really the enemy once you recognize their humanity. And if music can do that, if 8 guys playing jazz on a Wednesday night can crack through years of propaganda and hatred, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Sullivan died in 2003. At his funeral, a Japanese delegation attended, including 2 surviving former Camp McCoy prisoners. They brought with them a recording of Mood Indigo and asked that it be played during the service. As the music filled the church, the elderly Japanese men stood and bowed deeply, honoring the man who'd given them back their lives with nothing but a piano and honest emotion. The story of Japanese soldiers crying to jazz is the story of music's power to transcend the worst that humans inflict on each other. It's the story of how art can succeed where force fails, how beauty can crack through hate, how a trumpet's cry can speak truths that propaganda cannot silence. In the end, it's the story of Wednesday nights in Wisconsin when enemy soldiers stood in the snow and wept because someone played the music that insisted they were human. And in recognizing their own humanity reflected in that music, they took the first steps toward healing, toward peace, toward a future where former enemies could play jazz together and create beauty from the ashes of war. The tears were real. The transformation was real. And the music 70 years later still carries the same message. That individual voices matter, that emotion is strength, that humanity transcends borders and ideologies, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is a trumpet, a piano, and the simple truth of jazz. The barbed wire fences of Camp McCoy came down decades ago. The barracks were demolished. The guard towers torn apart. But the recreation hall still stands, preserved as a memorial to an accidental revolution. On Wednesday nights, local musicians still gather there to play jazz, continuing a tradition that began in wartime and proved that music can break chains that steel cannot. And somewhere in the crowd, if you listen carefully between the notes, you can still hear the echo of men crying. Not from grief or shame, but from the overwhelming relief of remembering, finally, what it means to be human.